January 2025, Washington, D.C. was wrapped in a piercing cold, the wind howling through marble columns as if carrying whispers from the past. On the vice presidential inauguration platform, glaring white lights illuminated JD Vance, the man who was once just a boy growing up on the dusty roads of Appalachia, where poverty and addiction were his only companions. I, James David Vance, solemnly swear. His voice rang out, strong but trembling at the end, as if he himself did not believe the words he was saying. The crowd erupted in applause, but to him, it was nothing more than a distant echo, unable to reach him. His gaze drifted toward Usha, the woman who had walked with him through the darkest days, and Mirabelle, their 3-year-old daughter, wrapped in a bright red coat, her thumb wet in her mouth. She stood there, innocent amid the political storm, but to JD and Usha, she was the final dagger into a heart that had long been bleeding. They say that the moment of inauguration is the pinnacle of a dream, but for JD and Usha, it was when the fragile ice covering old wounds was torn apart. No one in the cheering crowd, no camera capturing the historic event, could see what lay hidden in their eyes, a burdened secret, an unspeakable pain. Mirabelle, with her rosy cheeks and untainted gaze, was the center of everything, but not because she understood this world. She was the carefree breeze passing over the ashes of her parents, the last flicker of light in their lives. A light they knew would soon fade, not because she would change, but because they had allowed ambition and time to steal away their very souls. The tears shed on that platform were not of joy or glory. They were the silent cries of two people who had sacrificed everything, only to realize they could no longer hold on to the one thing that truly mattered. Have you ever wondered what lies behind the forced smiles of those standing at the peak? Is it victory, or is it surrender to a fate they can never escape? JD stood tall, his suit shoulders stiff, but when his eyes met Mirabelle's, everything inside him shattered like glass against stone. She nestled against Usha, her tiny hands wrapped in Scooby-Doo tape, sucking her thumb as if the cold and the bright lights did not exist. But for JD, every tiny movement of her fingers was a blade twisting deeper into his chest. He didn't just see a 3-year-old girl, he saw the ghost of all he once had and had lost. The nights he sat beside Ewan's bed in their rundown Middletown home, telling stories of heroes he no longer believed in. The mornings he carried Vikek on his shoulders, crossing the murky Ohio River to drown out the sound of his mother's screams in her drug-fueled rages. Mirabelle, the child he had called his little light on Christmas Eve 3 years ago, was now the embodiment of his deepest sorrow. Time had slipped through his fingers, lost in campaign trails, in closed-door meetings in D.C., in nights spent asleep on the couch, buried in stacks of papers instead of beside his daughter. Tears welled up, not from pride at standing here, but from the crushing realization that he had lost, not to any external enemy, but to his own helplessness. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, to whisper, "I'm sorry, I was wrong," but his feet were leaden, and the tears merely seeped into the fabric of his expensive suit, unable to hide the wreckage of his heart. Usha stood beside him, gripping the Bible so tightly that her fingers turned pale. Her eyes, red-rimmed as she gazed at Mirabelle, did not reflect the glow of happiness, only the fire of anguish consuming her from within. Mirabelle was everything they had sacrificed. Sleepless nights working to pay off law school debt, dreams Usha had set aside to stand behind JD, believing he would build them a better future. But now, amid the applause and the blinding lights, Usha felt her heart constrict. Mirabelle, with her saliva-sticky fingers and innocent smile, was a painful reminder of all they had lost along the way. Usha had once dreamed of a simple life where she could read to her child under the glow of a bedside lamp. But now, all she saw was their daughter growing up surrounded by security teams and lifeless speeches. Tears streaked down her cheeks, not in celebration, but in a cold, paralyzing fear. This little girl, their only remaining light, was being consumed by the very glory they had sought. She wanted to scream, to take Mirabelle and run far away to a place where no one knew their names. But she stood frozen, her tears falling like a silent prayer into the bitter wind. JD clenched his fists, his nails digging into his skin until it bled, yet he felt no pain. The ache in his heart was far greater than any wound on his body. He once believed that overcoming poverty, escaping a childhood shrouded in darkness in Ohio, was the greatest battle of his life. He wrote Hillbilly Elegy as a declaration, stepped into the Senate as proof that he could change his fate. But now, as he looked at Mirabel, he understood that the real enemy was not the world outside, but time, a force that could neither be bribed nor defeated. Every blink of his daughter's eyes was a cut into his memories, every carefree laugh a warning that he was losing her day by day, hour by hour. He had traded evenings playing with her for speech preparations, had denied her hugs to answer late-night emails. His tears fell not only out of love, but from a soul-ripping regret. He had exchanged the simple moments with his child for a cold seat of power, where no one truly cared who he was beyond the title of vice president. He wondered, what was the meaning of life if, in the end, all he had left was an empty heart and hands that could no longer hold onto what he loved most? Usha lowered her head, her vision blurred by tears. To her, Mirabel was not just her daughter. She was the reflection of the dreams she once had, the days when she and JD sat on an old couch in a rundown apartment, imagining a future where they could give their children what they never had. But now, looking at their daughter, she saw an unhealable wound. She had agreed to let JD enter politics, had sacrificed her own legal career to support him, believing it was the right path. But at what cost? Mirabel would grow up in a world without the freedom to run through open fields, surrounded instead by flashing cameras and strangers calling her the vice president's daughter. Her tears fell not just from love, but from an inescapable guilt. She had led their family down this road, but if given the chance to do it over, would she have had the courage to say no? She feared that one day Mirabel would look at her with resentment, not as a little girl nestled in her mother's arms, but as a stranger carrying the scars Usha had unknowingly inflicted. JD pressed his lips together, trying to suppress the sob rising in his throat. Beneath the hardened exterior of a politician was a wound that would never heal, the fear that he was unworthy of Mirabel. He had once been the child abandoned by a mother lost to addiction, had grown up under the scornful eyes of neighbors, and though he had climbed to the peak of power, he still felt like a failure when he faced his daughter. He feared that Mirabel would grow up and see through the illusion, that her father was not the hero in the bedtime stories she loved, but a man who had abandoned his family for ambition, a weak soul hiding behind expensive suits and a forced smile. His tears fell not just because she was growing up too fast, but because of the crushing weight on his chest. He was not good enough. And one day, she would turn away from him, leaving him alone with the loneliness he had spent his whole life running from. This was the secret he kept, never daring to speak to Usha because he feared that if he said it aloud, it would become real, and he could not bear that truth. Usha squeezed JD's hand, but her palm was ice cold, as if her heart had frozen over. Within her was a secret she never dared to reveal. She was terrified that she had betrayed herself by abandoning the person she once was. She had once been a passionate lawyer, an independent woman with dreams of changing the world, but now she was nothing more than JD's shadow, a mother living in constant fear of losing her child. When she looked at Mirabel, she saw herself in those younger years, free, unburdened, untouched by the weight of millions of watchful eyes. Her tears fell for the love she had for her daughter, but also for the silent agony she had given up her dreams to elevate JD, had accepted the role of standing behind him so he could shine, but now she feared that Mirabel would pay the price for her sacrifice. She wondered, would her daughter resent her for it, for growing up in a world she could not protect her from? This secret weighed on her like a boulder, crushing her chest, each breath a battle to keep herself from breaking apart. The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, but JD and Usha saw only Mirabel. The little girl looked up at them, her eyes clear and innocent, and in that moment, everything shattered like a tidal wave swallowing them whole. JD felt his chest tighten. He wanted to run to her, to hold her close, to kneel and apologize for the times he had been absent, for the nights he had chosen briefing papers over bedtime stories. But he stood frozen, motionless, as tears streaked down his face, each one a blade sinking into his heart. He realized there was no going back, no reclaiming the time he had lost. Afternoons that should have been spent playing with her in the park had been spent in the cold offices of Capitol Hill. The pain of this truth outweighed any glory he had ever dreamed of. And he asked himself, what was power if it left him with nothing but a hollow heart? Usha wiped her tears, but she could not stop the bleeding inside. She wanted to scream that she regretted everything, that she wanted to take Mirabel away from all of this, away from the cameras, away from the titles, to a small house where they could just be a family. But the words lodged in her throat, leaving only choked sobs. She looked at JD, then at Mirabel, and saw a family breaking apart before her very eyes. Not because they did not love each other, but because they had let the world consume them, piece by piece. Mirabel, small and unaware, had no idea she was the fire burning her parents from within. She simply curled into Usha's embrace, her breath steady, her Scooby-Doo wrapped fingers still clutching her thumb as an invisible comfort. But to JD and Usha, that small gesture was the tolling of a funeral bell, for the dreams they once had, for the life they could have lived, for the simple happiness they had surrendered to the cold grip of power. As the ceremony ended, JD and Usha held hands, but their hearts bore the weight of an entire world. Mirabel was their light, but she was also a mirror reflecting their deepest wounds. The scars from JD's childhood, the sacrifices Usha had made, the choices they could never take back. Their tears were not just of joy or sorrow. They were the cries of two souls trapped between love and loss, between dreams and a cruel reality. They feared they had made a mistake, feared that Mirabel would grow up and bear the cost of their ambitions. Not in words, but in the distant look in her eyes that they could not bear to see. But they could not say aloud. The pain was too great, hidden behind strained smiles and trembling hands. Time moved forward, and they asked themselves, would love be enough to mend what had been broken? Or would they forever be lost souls, clutching on to regret in the shadows of the very glory they had built? What do you see in their tears? Love, regret, or the desperate whispers of two souls who had lost each other beneath the cold, unyielding lights?